welcome to Wait, It Gets Better, the improvisational storytelling podcast, where every week a few friends get together with our ideas that we have thought about for a couple of days or a couple of weeks, and we combine them together into a story for you, the listener. Thank you for coming. I'm, of course, Levi.
I'm Reed.
And I'm Seth.
And we are here to tell you a story. Well, Reed's back after 2 weeks off, and he has listened to the episodes more recently than Seth or I, so he's going to give us a synopsis. Let's hear it.
All right, glad to be back. Yeah, I like this story, guys. It was, I wasn't in on it. I don't know if those two things are connected.
Well, you're in on it now.
Yeah. So the episode 1, Levi had history, and he talked about the ancient history here was like there was a group of 5 kings that there were 5 major land masses that were each ruled by a strong king, and they were constantly battling the Dark Lord who was trying to subjugate the whole world. And there were lots of stories, lots of epic, retellings of the great deeds of valor and all that. And about I think 1,500 years ago, there were 5 wizards that had emerged, that each wielded power, magical power, each of a different element, and they banded together to storm the Dark Lord's stronghold and killed him. And they became like the kings of, there was vast destruction, of course, because of the wars and everything and putting down the Dark Lord, but they became the kings of these 5 countries, and they were the only wielders of magic. And they were, they were a little bit full of themselves. People with power can be a little bit corrupted, and there were like they said, there's no other wielders of magic. But as another generation started coming up, a few people there seemed to be a resurgence of magic, and it seemed to be connected to the offspring of these wizard kings. And it turns out that they were, they were charismatic people, and let's just say they weren't chaste in their behavior. And it turns out that the people that could manifest magic were known as their bastards. Well, it's kind of a harsh term. And as time went on and more wielders of magic came up, they became known as the baseborn. And there was kind of a rebellion against the tyranny of what had come down from these wizard kings. And they said, we got to have some kind of system to handle this magic. So the wizards were kind of forced to form these schools to train those baseborn that manifested these magical tendencies, so they could be responsible in the use of their magic. And so Seth had the pantheon. He said it wasn't really it was a system of household gods where everybody was trying to get by and do the best they could, and they would have little idols set up, and they would pray to like the god of the harvest or the god of fertility for their herds and flocks, whatnot, and blessings for the crops and those kinds of things. And Seth introduced a character which they decided was like a wise old man type guy. He was like a traveling monk, and he had kind of made a point of getting to know these mages that were coming up through the system. And he learned as they died, or as he maybe killed them off, who knows, but to trap the essence of their magic in an idol. And he used to go around and he would have these household gods, but they would be imbued with actual power. So it kind of lent itself to using the old beliefs into building kind of a little enterprise for himself. And in any case, then the next episode, Levi had the wise old woman and Seth had the villain. Now, the villain was Darren, and he was one of the kings of these. He was one of these lords of one of the ruling clans, and he was the leader of one of the schools. And he began to see the idea of really making it institutional. In other words, the the magic would be almost doled out based on what people would be able to supply to the schools and to him, and there became a bureaucracy built up around it, kind of like a network around these different schools. The wise old woman was Darling, and she'd been around, and she had been imbued with the the spirit had from the wizard that she had served as a servant, really kind of like a higher servant. And but she was, because like no one pays any attention to the help, they kind of hear lots of things, and she tended to know where the bodies were buried, so to speak. She knew about all the things that went on, and she just persisted on down through the ages, and served the wizard until he finally did pass away. But she carried on, and she one of the manifestations of magic that she had was that she could just translate herself into in each of the different 5 schools wherever she was needed. And I guess does that give you kind of an idea?
Yeah, that sounds good.
Okay. I didn't.
What story element did you have for this week?
I have hero sidekick.
How about you, Seth?
I have hero.
I have villain sidekick. So I think we should hear hero sidekick villain. How does that sound?
Sounds pretty good.
Okay, great. Let's hear it.
All right. So the hero, his name is Troy, and he is a baseborn. He's, I don't know, what do you guys, probably late middle age to late middle age, kind of looking towards retirement. But he has, for most of his life, kind of run a mercenary kind of group that I guess would be, correct me if I'm getting this wrong, but kind of like a traditional paladin kind of idea. He's doesn't always work for money. It's always, he works for the cause because the cause is right.
Yeah.
And so he's really kind of a hiccup, or people like him are kind of a hiccup in, I think it's Darren's kind of idea of kind of bureaucratizing the baseborn and eventually turning them into, pay to play god figures, is because his group kind of always ebbs and flows, but again, kind of in a traditional paladin kind of way. He'll help someone out for, a hot meal and a bed, not taking much else aside from the small amount that he needs to be on his way, or the kindness of those that he helps. And so, but he's been doing this his whole life. And one of the things that he does is take, other baseborn under his wing, either ones that have, graduated from one of the schools or have been kicked out or have been missed by, the schools, and will kind of bring them up, kind of, I guess you could say kind of, Jedi and Padawan kind of thing, show them the ropes and hopefully direct them down the same path that he has. And so over the years, he's trained kind of like, so you could come out of the school and, be book smart, but, he's been living, most of his, life on the street, hand to mouth.
Right. Right.
Down in the muck of it. So I think that's kind of what he's done. So he's kind of, maybe the villain knows him because he's, been around a long time and is a well-known name of someone that kind of is turning out a lot of baseborn to something that would reveal them for being what Darren doesn't want people to know them as
right.
I guess you could say free agents.
Right. And also relatable, not godlike.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's cool.
That's great.
Now you said he's like, you said close to retirement. Is that a part of his who he is, or no? You didn't. You said middle age.
Yeah, middle age to, and so as far as like a magic user, he could be like 150 years old, maybe getting close to 200. I mean, if the
Right.
wizards live for, at least like 500, most baseborn, let's say, do live to like 250, 300 maybe.
Yeah, not as long as the
Um,
original wizards, but still longer than the normal human.
Yeah.
Cool. Reed, do you want to hear who's the
I have Hero's sidekick. Maybe I should jump in.
unless you want to hear villain's sidekick.
Okay.
All right, so the original villain of the story is of course the Dark Lord.
Yeah.
Right? He reigned terror thousands of years ago. He had things the likes of which no one has any idea. Right? It's things that he made, and he tamed things that prophecies were written about later on in life. So, the villain's sidekick is a basically it's a stone golem the size of a I don't know, 600 feet tall.
I was going to say a small
And wide.
continent.
Yeah, no, really, a huge one, right? He currently, but I don't mean a golem like you would think of, but basically it, the Dark Lord had hundreds of these, and they would walk across the oceans and assault countries, and they were huge. They could hold hundreds and hundreds of people inside of them. They had like facilities. It's like a walking base, basically, right? And it's currently lost to time. People knew that these things existed, but the size of them and the size of them and the whereabouts of them are gone. No one knows about them. However, Darren, in his sort of quest for power, has taken a huge interest in a lot of the antiquities and a lot of the old information. And this is one of the things he's been looking for, because passed down through the years is a key to get inside one of these, right? And so he eventually gets inside, finds one. It's like right outside the city, like the main capital city, because on the grounds, on the like sort of the main square of the capital city, there's a big plaque that says that there was a fight against the Dark Lord here, and such and such a guy defeated such and such a general, and they founded a city where he died, which is right here. So it's like history is really close to us, guys. It's just like literally over the hill from the city, under the ground. Maybe there's like a knee, kind of like if you lay on your back and you have your knee bent up. It's kind of like a hill like that. And he finds this thing, and it's just like a vast treasure trove of wealth and information. Right here we have preserved methods for harvesting the elements, because back when the Dark Lord was the Dark Lord, there was no wizards. There was no persons who could wield magic. So they had to use things to it was closer to alchemy, or closer to alchemy when it comes to magic back then, right? So you'd use a crystal that was purified in this place and in this place, and it would pull spirit towards it, and then you'd grind that up and put that into something, and there'd be a lot of outside power wielded, but it'd be outside of you. So he has been sort of slowly amassing the necessary components to sort of put this back together. And the last thing that he needs is, because one of the things that was broken was the soul jar, which was the container for the soul, the thing that would drive this thing. So right now, the villain's sidekick is his big main enforcer. I can't think of a name. Brutus. Big knuckle duster, big gorilla of a guy. not very many brains, but enough to do what the boss says, doesn't mind roughing up anyone who the boss asks. And Darren pretty much has him pegged. That once everything is all set in place, he'll be able to do the ritual to remove the soul from Brute and put it into the soul jar and put it into this giant machine. And he's just kind of waiting. He's sort of gathering the resources, sending people out, on the cover of darkness to not uncover it, but to just like repair it and look at it. This is one of the reasons why he's risen to such prominence, and why people feel like he is kind of like a renaissance of information, is because he's literally in this golem. There's like history books and, intact machinery, and he is able to sort of take that and then pass that off as his own. And he's like the, here he is. He's bringing in a new era of thought, and where really he's just kind of stealing all these ideas. And at some point in time, Brute is going to be installed into this big thing, and then big thing's going to walk around and do something violent. That's the villain sidekick.
Cool. That's really fun. What a fun story. Yeah. It's I've got hero sidekick. His name is Mose. That's what everybody calls him. He's the youngest of 5 brothers, and these
Nice.
are all sons of a rancher. And the rancher's dad just settled this area. Was kind of waste, but his dad never admitted to anyone, but he had a clear tendency to manipulate water, and he was able to dig a well, and it would become a gushing spring. And places where there had been no ability for agriculture or grazing
Right.
suddenly had water. And it was not close to population centers, so they just kind of kept it quiet. They were just successful, and they had vast holdings, and who knew, And Moses' mother clearly showed base-born abilities, and as did one of his uncles and 2 of his older brothers. Problem is, Mose was busted, so to speak, outed. He was in town, and he used his powers to avert tragedy. And like everybody, whoa, and then he was kind of forced to be sent to school.
Right.
So he actually went to Darren's school, and he'd grown up with their tendency towards self-reliance. He had been trained to solve problems and get things done. And besides having his magical abilities, he also showed real strong administrative and organizational skills. And Darren, had a good eye for people with talent, and he made use of this guy, and he was kind of becoming kind of a wheel, but he kept his own counsel, but he was real kind of mistrustful of Darren and the whole super organizational bureaucratic approach to where this was all headed, and what would that mean for people like and like him and his brothers. And he didn't tell anybody. Of course, they didn't want the notoriety, right? They just wanted to be free and do their thing. Mose had a real tendency toward the idealistic, and he had a liberty orientation. He also happened to make the acquaintance of Darling, and he had a real affinity for her. He thought she was the real deal, and he began very early on in his schooling period that he should gather as much information as possible on what Darren was up to, because he has a feeling that at a certain point he was going to have to pick sides, because especially if the tendency toward abusing power went the way it looked like it was going to go. And what kind of tipped the thing for him was one of his brothers had gotten in contact with Troy and had become kind of part of his group. So here, here you have Mose, who being trained up by Darren and knows things from the inside and knows all the players, but he comes down on the side of he's coming down on the side of Troy, and he's got a lot of information to bring. And I don't know how close he was in on the Gollum project, but I know he had a lot of inside information.
So how do we want this story to roll out? Right? Obviously, there's going to be a pretty big prologue. Is that the one that comes before?
Yeah.
There's going to be a pretty big prologue with a couple of timestamps, with like a 50 years later, 100 years later, 200 years later, and then a present day kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
The system that's being set up by Darren is clearly overreaching. Seth, I remember you had said, I think it was last week, talked about how some of the baseborn just go off and do like adventure party stuff. That's like a lot of what they do.
Yeah.
Now is Darren starting to get kind of, dare I say, racist in his talking? Kind of like Harry Potter, like the Mudbloods.
The Muggles, yeah.
The Muggles, and then you have Muggles, Mudbloods, and then, real wizards.
Mm-hmm.
That kind of class distinction, between the people who can't have magic, the people who can have magic, but their family doesn't have magic in it, and then the people who have magic and their lineage is well established.
I think so. I think maybe not directly, but I think one of those things where, kind of like how like Palpatine would have taken power in Star Wars, where he comes off as really distraught that they're not doing enough. But if they had a change of power,
right,
and so a lot of what he does is it's all for the good, right? If we have all these people who are not representing, I mean, that's why they had the schools in the first place, right? So that people could be trained. And then you have these people that escape the grasp of the school or get into these other groups and start not behaving according, to the rules and bylaws of, the graduates of, our prestigious schools, ultimately circling around so that, it's like, anyone that hasn't gone through the schools will get purged. Everyone that hasn't, doesn't keep up to the standard, just for everybody's safety, right? And so it's like a long-term, for the good of everybody else, so maybe nothing directly unless you kind of catch the undertones.
Right. I think that also part of this thing is that I just had this idea, is that the 5 schools, one of the reasons why they were chosen as the places up for the schools is because they were like Dark Lord fortresses, right?
Okay.
That had well-established systems for dealing with magic and dealing with the power, and they were empty as well, and they were like all enchanted so they wouldn't like break or, wear down or anything like that. Part of the thing I'm thinking about is that the time is a giant wheel, right? That Darren is trying to bring back, like I said before, a sort of magical renaissance, and he thinks, or he feels like, this is the way to do it. This is how we're going to do it. And he's kind of reading the writings of the Dark Lord and using that as his kind of a guiding light.
Yeah.
And at first, he justifies it by saying, "Well, I'm not killing anyone right now." Right? And then he had the first person killed who found out about his plans. He's kind of one of those people who was like, yeah, I did a bunch of stuff wrong, but we're going to make a better tomorrow out of it.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
I
I kind of think of like an Andros Guile from the Lightbringer. who it's like he did good things, he also did bad things, you know? Well, not so much in this because I do think that Darren is the villain, but all I'm saying is that he is bringing this renaissance of technology, of power back, and kind of trying to whitewash the Dark Lord and say, you know, his opinions, they were really difficult for the time. They were really maybe that's why we disagreed with him so much, is because of how difficult they were. You know?
Oh,
what he
man.
did back then wasn't a true dark era because they didn't do it right. But if we do it right according to the way I see it now,
Well, no, maybe more so like if you try to do brain surgery without knowing how to do brain surgery, you might look like a serial killer. Right? You might look like a murderer. But once you know how to do brain surgery, you can do it right.
Yeah.
So they couldn't do it right then because they didn't have, you know, they didn't have the resources. They had the kings, you know, those like difficult monarchs to deal with. And we've got like, we're enlightened now. We've got the schools. We have magic everywhere. We know how to do it. Like, we can really accomplish it the right way now.
Mm-hmm.
Right? And it's this really kind of everyman's argument. You know? It's this like, we can all do it. Let's all come together and do it together. But the thing is that if you can't keep up with how fast things will change because you can't use magic, then maybe you don't get issued marriage licenses. Maybe you can't open businesses. You know, that's kind of the thought process I was thinking about. While he brings a lot of this technology from the past that's been locked away in order to sort of try and prove that his way of thinking actually brings progress, where really he's just taking and stealing all of these things from the past. Does that make sense? What do you guys think about that?
It does make sense. A couple of things flitted through my mind, but you know, it's all right. Communism has never really been tried. It's never been done right. I'm sorry.
No, that's fine. That's your opinion, and I fully respect it and agree with it. I'm not saying that this guy's saying to be communist, but
I know.
there are plenty of ideologies that we can look at and say they didn't really understand how to do that. If I did it, I do it right.
Yeah,
You
as
know?
long as I was in charge.
Yeah, if I was in charge,
Yeah,
it would work out right the way we
yeah,
wanted it to.
as long as Darren's in charge, you know, it's going to be good, right?
Yeah. So that's kind of how I see the story sort of unfolding, where then you have Troy, who is like really set apart from a lot of the opinions, really set apart from a lot of the Sawyer sort of classist thought processes. You know,
Yep.
like the education that they're taught in the schools now doesn't say that you're better than the people who can't do than the unbaseborn. It doesn't say that, but it does say, you know, maybe they just don't understand you. They just don't have the same sort of things to go through like you have to go through, you know? And it begins to sort of create this divide between the baseborn and everyone else. But how does Troy is Troy like a well-known person, you think, Seth?
I think he's fairly well known. Like perhaps he's written a couple books on his I guess his versions of philosophy,
Right.
way
Right.
of, you know, way of things. I had another idea too. As far as like how certain things would start creeping in to like put a precedent. So I think maybe like scholarships are being given, or maybe Darren has like a program that's giving scholarships to
Okay.
baseborn people whose parents are baseborn based on how much more powerful they are.
That makes
which
sense.
would basically encourage an idea for baseborn, if they want a good life for their kids, right, to marry other baseborn.
Right.
Because if you don't, well, then that makes a half possibility of that recessive gene to then just start looping out of existence, right?
Right.
So that could be one way that, let's say that was kind of an aside or like a little bit different, but just another thing that could be going on as far as how a slight superiority without being directly saying, oh, they're better.
Right.
Yeah, it's that notion of an educated academic elite class, the expert class.
Right. Because I think something to remember too is his eventual plan is to basically turn themselves, the most powerful, people on top, into the, gods of the people, just as soon as they can be far enough removed and have their, power paid for, by the, the willing masses to have something done, but, through their bureaucracy and, whatnot. But
that's great. So how does do we want to try and finish? I think we could finish this out if we wanted to today, or we can go one more week and wrap it up that way. What do you guys think? I have some ideas for how things can kind of start coming to an ahead, but if you guys want to sort of play in this space a little bit more, I'm happy to do that.
Why don't you go ahead and pull the trigger?
Third one?
Yeah, why don't you go ahead and pull the trigger, Levi, with your eye, because I have some ideas to add in too. So
okay. So, as all things end, there is some big decision that needs to happen at the city, the main capital city, where that is the closest to the school, or is centered around the school that Darren is the head of, right? There is continual unrest. Troy has been traveling throughout the sort of countryside, as with his newest batch of I'd call them disciples, maybe.
Right.
Just trying to impart to them the realities of humanity and where they are. He comes across the wise old man, and at first it's kind of like a conflict. And maybe at first you kind of get the thought that maybe this is kind of like the lone villain, He's kind of like a serial killer for baseborn. He comes and kills baseborn, and, he's like, give the power back to the people kind of guy, And there's like a brief conflict, and you see a little bit of what Troy maybe was in the past when it comes to like violence, or what he could be in the future. He's a much calmer, much more kind of learned man now, but, he was young once. As that's moving, what's the hero sidekick name? Mose is sort of getting in more and more onto Darren's plans, right? As Darren has kind of picked Mose up as the intellectual and as the talented person he is, Darren's always trying to surround himself with powerful people. Mose has a little bit, because he's a little bit of a country boy, he has a little bit of a, I just want to be accepted. It's like big city boy, boy in the big city, and he understands his morals and what he should do, but here's the head of the school giving him attention, and so he kind of goes astray a little bit, and maybe you think that he's the villain's sidekick, where he's not, and he goes around with Brute sometimes, and this last one is kind of out to the pile, as they call it, the golem.
Mm-hmm.
In the city, there's a lot of civil unrest as the indoctrination of the younger baseborn is beginning to kind of creep over into cruelty into the non-magic users. The older baseborn who were indoctrinated or are indoctrinated have the sense not to run their mouth.
Yes.
In a tavern full of non-magical people. You know? But a young, cocky baseborn goes down to a thing, feels like he's on top of the world because he can make fireballs, and doesn't catch the knife in the back of his neck because he went to a seedy neighborhood and called people mere mortals.
Yeah.
You know? So there's just stuff like that. And Darren views all of this as a really as all really valuable, right? This is just fire to the flame.
Yeah.
You know, for sure, when he raises up the golem, everyone, it will, you know, it'll be obvious.
Right.
And so as Troy begins to make his way back to the town, back to the city, you know, words of civil unrest and things are starting to like heat up and move out, you know, and he's like noticing these things, and a messenger comes to him and tells him, you know, what's going on, you know, and they make a sort of side trip over to the School of Spirit, right, where they meet and talk to Darling, right?
Yes.
And they find out about from Mose, you know, his message, they find out about the pile, the golem, and they start to put things together, and Darling just kind of lays stuff out, right?
Right.
And they go through their Moria experience. I realize I just been reading Lord of the Rings. Every story has a Moria experience.
Yep.
You know, there's Mirkwood, there's Moria, there's the what's it called in Wheel of Time? The ways.
The ways.
You know, everyone has their like go through a deep dark place.
Yep.
You know, as a shortcut. They have that Moria experience where Darling kind of leads them through these weird tunnels and connected, and they see that they're basically living in the country where the Dark Lord was the Dark Lord.
Right.
Right? And there's tons of bad, not spirits, but there's tons of bad omen. The ground is not blessed.
Yes.
Right? And that's beginning to bubble up as more baseborn are using power. It's kind of breaking the seal, and everything is kind of bubbling up.
Right.
Right? As they arrive at the city via the north gate, right? The wise old man arrives at the city via the east gate.
Okay.
Like with the rising sun. And he makes his way through, right? And things are up in an uproar, and things are crazy, and they kind of, it's not fight their way through, but it's kind of spiritual warfare fight your way through.
Yeah.
You know? Everything's like waiting on a pinprick. You know, there's groups of people, of humans, of non-magic humans, sort of massing up, ready to sort of overthrow these bastards.
Yeah.
You know, there's groups of baseborn rising up, believing the lies that they're somehow better because they can channel fireballs.
Yeah.
And Troy makes his way down to, I was going to say his church, but I would say his church is his mission.
Right.
You know, it's not so much a church as it is a mission, a place for a base of operations for him and the people who his disciples, right? And they kind of are trying to figure out what to do. Mose shows up, lets them know, you know, they're like hot on the heels. Something happens. You know, I don't know what it is.
Well, I think that Darren probably, you know, activates, you know,
The pile.
Right. Right.
So over the hill, you see a person stand up.
Right. And the thing of it is that I don't think Darren recognized that there's this vast network, that Troy, you know, isn't just his little band of mercenaries. He's connected with people that had been mistrustful of the system now, like for generations, like Moses' grandpa and his dad and his older brothers, you know, and one of his brothers had literally been running with Troy. So he had direct conduit to all the intel that Mose could provide about what Darren was up to. So these forces are converging at just the right time, and it's not something that Darren could have anticipated.
Right. And what else Darren couldn't anticipate, because he was building all of these structures and all of these things based on what he was reading about and what he was learning about the Dark Lord. But it's like the Ring. I've been reading Lord of the Rings, so it's on the brain. If you take it for yourself, yes, you might defeat the Dark Lord, but then you would sit down in his chair.
And what would you become? Yes. Yeah.
You know? So he gives the order to fight, and the fight does ensue. And
Yeah.
yes, the mission doesn't burn immediately, but the pile, the golem, begins it to make its way to the city. And then, there's fights, there's valor, people are, fighting, and people are dying, and people are, there's a speech by some point by Troy, right? It all sort of ends up with the golem being there, with all these baseborn being there, and the wise old man being at the center of the town, where the huge square is, where the big plaque that says, "On this spot was built, this city will be founded because this such and such a person was, died here." The wise old man channels all of the spirit that he's been, as he kills a baseborn, or as he, takes a baseborn's power and puts it into a thing. A person's soul is bound to their body with spirit, and he doesn't take their soul because it's not his to take, but he does take all the spirit and puts it into a jar, and all the spirit and puts it into a jar, and now he takes it and reinstalls the seal that was supposed to be put onto this place, and sort of pushes down all the corruption that was there. Right. And so, just like that, people regain the ability to think clearly again.
Yeah.
Right. They aren't, their minds aren't clouded by hate and fear.
Yeah.
I mean, they're still fighting, but if they just take a second, they realize they have no reason to fight, that this person isn't the enemy, that they've been deceived on both sides, and that doesn't mean that the fighting ends, and that doesn't mean that everyone is peaceful right away, but that does mean that everyone recognizes that there was some sort of other influence that was sort of stoking the bellows, as it was, on people's fear and uncertainty.
Yeah.
What happens to Darren, you might say? Well, they get to the pile, and Brute doesn't want to do the operation. He's not interested in having his soul ripped out of his body and installed in a huge machine.
Yeah.
So Darren kills him, and then uses the spirit from Brute's body and cuts out his own soul and installs it into the soul jar. Right? So it's Darren that is in the big thing. And for a minute, he feels like he's accomplished his goal. Like, look at this.
Right.
He's a god, He has element collectors. He can shoot fire. He can shoot lasers. He can house an army inside of him. But, it's obviously not all that it cracked up to be. This is a thin picture of what the thing that he actually wanted was, and he's defeated, by everyone. Yeah. The baseborns that he raised up, and the humans that he thought were useless animals.
I if you haven't seen Braveheart, this will be lost on you a little bit, but there's a character that I think of as Moe's grandpa, the guy that had the knack for water. Like, he comes in from the ranch, and he's just this tough as nails old guy, and he starts breaking forth springs in real inconvenient places for this big stone golem. And I don't know. It's just kind of a thought that I had randomly popped through.
Yeah, that's cool. Well, Seth, how's that for an ending? What do you think?
I think it works.
Okay. Well, you can do the next one like that. Well, I think that's a good idea. We should get so far and then just ask someone to take it away.
Yeah, good idea.
All right.
That was a really good story. I really like your stone golem. That just added a feature that was a lot of fun.
Yeah. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us for this episode of Wait It Gets Better. If you like this episode, please let us know. Our email address at waititgetsbettercast@gmail.com, or you can add us on Twitter at @getsbettercast. If you like this episode, give us a thumbs up, tell your friends, or just listen to it again. If you didn't like this episode, I would say just wait. It gets better. Cut.